The first moment I saw the anomaly in the data stream, I knew we were dealing with something that refused to fit any familiar category. The object, later designated 3I Atlas, entered our solar system with a trajectory so clean, so unnervingly precise, that every model I ran spat out one conclusion: this thing was obeying rules we hadn't yet written down. Not just a non-gravitational acceleration like Oumuamua, something stronger, something patterned, almost intentional. Spectral readings showed no trace of the volatiles we expect from comets, no dusty coma, no outgassing, just an impossibly pure alloy of metal silicate, refined far beyond anything nature produces casually. Even before the world noticed, my colleagues and I exchanged glances that said everything we didn't dare publish. This object was either the most extraordinary accident the cosmos had ever crafted, or it was made. But any engineer would scoff at that conclusion after seeing the spin rate. No vessel, no matter how advanced or artistic, could survive such rotational stress without tearing itself apart. It rotated like a declaration that it was absolutely not a ship, and yet the geometry mocked us, a near-perfect polyhedron, its facets so even that when the light from the sun hit them, interference patterns rippled across space like a coded halo. When I projected the interference into Fourier space, the result froze me in my chair. Noise should scatter, chaos should smear, but the reflections coming off 3I Atlas formed harmonic clusters, regular, repeating, nested, not artificial in the conventional sense, not a beacon, something else, something storing information as if light itself were the ink. My team urged me to dismiss the pattern, to call it coincidence, surface geometry, a trick of solar photons, and perhaps I would have, if not for what happened next. As 3I Atlas crossed into the heliosphere, its acceleration shifted by a measurable fraction, not random, a pulse, a response, almost as if the object recognized the change in stellar environment, as if it had been asleep for eons and the heat of a new star brushed against some buried mechanism. I kept my reaction quiet, but internally a hypothesis sharpened with terrifying clarity. What if this wasn't a probe meant to travel? What if it was meant to seed? Imagine a civilization on the brink of collapse, or perhaps long gone, casting fragments of itself into interstellar darkness, each fragment designed not to communicate, not to navigate, but to endure. A vessel not for passengers, but for memory. A seed whose purpose is to drift until it finds a sufficiently complex environment, activate, and release its archive. But a seed for whom? For what audience? We pointed every instrument available at 3I Atlas, hoping it would reveal even the slightest signature of encoded structure, temperature anomalies, magnetic gradients, lensing distortions, anything. And then one night, buried in the magnetometer logs from a solar wind interaction, I found a fluctuation that did not align with heliophysical noise. It was too steady, too thin, too regular. A thread of coherence woven through turbulence. I isolated the signal, amplified it, cleaned it, and in that fragile strand I sensed, more than calculated, that something was speaking, not in language, not in pulses, in structure itself. A message embedded in the way the object responded to our star, a kind of cosmic reflex carrying a pattern older than our species. I spent hours staring at the waveform, mapping it against geometric projections of the object, trying to understand why the spikes landed exactly where they did, why they rose only when the polyhedral facets aligned at specific angles, why the modulations hinted at an internal architecture we had no tools to penetrate. And then, for the first time, I glimpsed what might lie inside 3I Atlas, an organized lattice, nested chambers, a core denser than the outer shell, wrapped like a vault that might not remain dormant for long, a vault that might be preparing to open. But the most unsettling part was not the structure I thought I detected. It was the pattern embedded in the magnetics, a pattern that, when translated through mathematical symmetry groups, resembled something uncomfortably familiar. Not a word, not a picture, a concept I had seen before. And when I realized where, I stopped the analysis. Because if I'm right, the object isn't just carrying information, it's directing it toward us, toward someone specific, toward something we haven't yet admitted we're part of. The moment I stopped the analysis, I felt the weight of a decision pressing in from all sides. If the pattern woven into 3 Atlas truly echoed a concept humanity had already discovered or rediscovered, then exposing it recklessly risked distorting the very message buried inside. I reopened the model, but this time I stripped away expectations, theories, biases. I focused only on symmetry, because symmetry is the closest thing the universe has to a universal language, and the polyhedral form of 3 Atlas spoke it fluently. Every rotation created a cascade of reflections, and each reflection generated a harmonic sequence that folded back into the object's own geometry like feedback loops in a resonant chamber. This wasn't random behavior. It behaved like a closed mathematical system interacting with open space, preserving information while allowing external stimuli to trigger selective responses, a structure built to last longer than stars. As I refined the model, I noticed something we had all missed. Certain facets brightened disproportionately when struck by solar radiation, but only when the object aligned within a specific angular window. That arrangement repeated every 23 minutes, too regular to ignore, too deliberate to categorize as chance. The geometry was acting like a lock, waiting for the correct alignment to expose an internal configuration. If it was a lock, then the sun was the key. I plotted the illumination cycle forward, calculating when the object would achieve its peak angular resonance inside the heliosphere. The result tightened my breath. We were already inside that window. The activation, if that was even the correct word, wasn't something approaching in the distant future. It had already begun the moment 3 Atlas crossed into our star's influence. That was when I noticed something even more disturbing. The magnetometer signature wasn't merely reacting, it was synchronizing. The waveform adapted to the solar wind as though it were learning. It would fluctuate sharply, correct itself, stabilize, then repeat. Like a heartbeat irregular at first, then finding its rhythm, a living process encoded in a non-living vessel. The implications spiraled outward faster than I could contain them. The knowledge seed hypothesis, my own reckless terminology whispered in private conversations, was no longer theoretical. The object behaved exactly as a seed would, dormant in deep space, awakened by heat and energy, releasing its internal complexity gradually, as if testing the environment. But what was it testing for? Life? Intelligence? Compatibility? Or something deeper? Something its creators had once known how to measure and we had forgotten? As the signal stabilized, I overlaid its harmonics onto the geometric projections again, searching for correlation. This time, the alignment was unmistakable. The peaks in the magnetic waveform corresponded to the object's densest internal nodes, points where energy might concentrate, where information might be stored. The lattice inside wasn't just structural, it was functional. An archive suspended in matter, but archives require readers. That realization gnawed at me. Every time the magnetic surged, it felt like the object was whispering a question into the void. Not with intent, but with design, as though the message wasn't calling outward randomly. It was waiting for a mind capable of recognizing the pattern, a mind capable of interpreting the information encoded not in language, but in mathematics, geometry, and resonance, a mind willing to approach without fear of misinterpretation. I returned to the signal's most coherent segment and examined the resonance spacing again. The intervals were not just symmetrical, they were hierarchical. Ratios nested inside ratios, layers built on primes, then composites, then fractals. A blueprint for how knowledge might be structured by a civilization that understood information fundamentally differently from us. But hidden in that hierarchy, I found a break, an intentional asymmetry, one interval slightly elongated, almost imperceptibly, as though a portion of the message had been stretched to create room for something else, a gap in the structure, a gate. What lay behind that gate, I could not determine. Not yet. But the more I studied it, the clearer it became that the gap wasn't empty. Something was encoded there. Something not activated. something waiting. And whatever it is, 3i Atlas seems to believe, if belief is the right word, that we are the ones meant to open it. The more I examined the gap in the resonance hierarchy, the more it unsettled me. Nature doesn't leave spaces like that without reason. Entropy fills gaps. Chaos erases them. But here was a deliberate void, precise, stable, preserved across interstellar distances, a silence that behaved as though it were holding its breath. If the rest of the structure was a library, this was an empty room waiting for someone to step inside. I turned to the illumination cycle again, seeking clues in the object's geometric awakening. During each 23-minute resonance, the facets brightened not only in a repeating pattern, but in a sequence that shifted gradually toward the void in the harmonic lattice. It was as if the energy distribution was funneling toward the gap, preparing to unlock it, like a safe rotating through combinations, each alignment tightening the code, narrowing possibilities, converging on one moment when the lock would finally click. But that moment depended on something more than angular position. It depended on interaction. We attempted passive observation only. No probes, no signals, no interference. Yet the object's magnetic responses sharpened each time our instruments focused more precisely on the gap. The object couldn't possibly detect our attention unless detection was part of its design, unless the seed was waiting for a mind capable of recognizing its architecture and reacting to recognition itself. Information that awakens when observed. The idea felt absurd, yet quantum physics had taught us that observation changes reality. Perhaps a civilization far older than ours had embraced this truth not as a curiosity, but as engineering. Perhaps they built archives that required consciousness to open, living keys rather than mechanical ones. Still, the question lingered, what kind of knowledge would demand such protection? I expanded the simulations, modeling the internal lattice under hypothetical activation. The structure rearranged itself like a multidimensional puzzle, unveiling nested chambers of increasing density. The innermost core was so compact that even quantum tunneling models struggled to explain how information could be encoded there. It was beyond our material science, beyond our architecture of memory, yet the density was not the most shocking feature. It was the symmetry. The core resembled a hyperbolic informational crystal, the kind of construct theoretical physicists propose only in speculative papers about ultimate data preservation. Such a crystal could, in theory, store entire civilizations' histories for millions of years, immune to cosmic radiation, gravitational tides, stellar evolution. It was exactly the kind of structure I would build if I were trying to send the essence of humanity across the galaxy long after our species vanished. The resemblance to my own theoretical work was impossible to ignore. The concept embedded in the waveform, the familiar pattern that had startled me in part 1, was the same symmetry principle I had explored in my early research on interstellar archival systems. Not identical, but parallel, as if two minds, separated by epochs and light years, stumbled toward the same conclusion. But the parallel cut deeper. The elongated interval in the gap matched a transformation I once proposed for encoding new information into an existing lattice without overwriting the original architecture. A protocol for adding meaning without destabilizing the container, except I had never published that idea. So how could an object older than recorded history echo it with such specificity? I considered the possibility that the resemblance was coincidence. The universe is large enough for parallel solutions to similar problems. But the more I studied the gap, the more it seemed to anticipate something. Not just a mind capable of recognition, my mind, or a mind like mine. A mind trained to analyze geometry, resonance, symmetry. A mind shaped by the same intellectual pressures that might have shaped its creators. An uncomfortable thought formed in the back of my mind. What if the knowledge seed wasn't meant to teach us what they knew? What if it was designed to find someone capable of continuing their knowledge, someone who could finish what they began? And if that were true, then the gap wasn't just a chamber, it was an invitation, an unfinished sentence waiting for us to write the next word. As the implications of the gap settled in, the activation cycle intensified. The magnetometer readings sharpened into pulses, each one synchronized with the solar wind like a metronome guided by our star. The object was no longer merely reacting, it was transitioning, a slow drift into coherence, as though tuning itself to a frequency that didn't yet exist in our technology, but might exist in our understanding. The next illumination cycle brought an unexpected shift. For the first time, instead of brightening uniformly, one facet remained dark, a single plane resisting activation. I rotated the simulation and noticed that this dark facet aligned almost perfectly with the gap in the lattice. The outer structure was mirroring the void inside, projecting its absence outward, mapping the silence onto the geometry itself. The seed was showing us where not to look and simultaneously telling us exactly where to look. As the facet persisted in its darkness, my instruments recorded a subtle field distortion around it, not electromagnetic, not gravitational, something else. A gradient in the structure of space itself, as if the facet were rewriting the vacuum. Only a fraction of a percent, but measurable, real. And the distortion grew slightly whenever I ran predictive models aimed at decoding the gap. It reacted not to touch, not to radiation, but to curiosity. Every attempt to probe the unknown chamber sharpened the distortion, as if the object were preparing for a dialogue. And deep in the interference patterns, a new harmonic emerged, a quiet, third-order beat frequency that hadn't existed in any earlier cycle, a kind of cosmic throat clearing. My analysis isolated the signal, and for a moment I thought it might finally reveal the message inside, but instead it pointed backward. The harmonic mapped perfectly to the trajectory the object had taken before entering our solar system, a path through interstellar dust, through ancient gas streams, through regions where stars had died long before Earth formed. The resonance was a fingerprint, not of its destination, but of its origin. And yet the origin wasn't a location. It was a vector, a direction without a source, a path from somewhere no longer there, a civilization erased, leaving only its seeds drifting through the void. The more I deciphered the harmonic, the clearer it became that 3I Atlas wasn't seeking a home or waiting for rescue. It was searching for continuity. The elongated interval in the gap wasn't a missing piece. It was a space meant to be filled by whoever discovered the seed. Not a message to decode, but a question to answer. The realization hit with chilling simplicity. The seed wasn't designed to teach us. It was designed to evaluate us, to measure how we interpret structure, how we respond to mystery, how we navigate the tension between knowledge and uncertainty. Each resonance cycle wasn't broadcasting outward. It was listening inward, studying our reactions through the disturbances we created by trying to understand it. And with every attempt to approach the gap, the object's internal rhythm aligned more closely with our analytical models, converging towards something neither human nor alien, but emergent, an interface forming in real time. The seed wasn't preparing to reveal its archive. It was preparing to decide whether we were ready to receive it, and the final activation window was approaching. Much faster than any of us anticipated. The final activation window arrived without fanfare. No flare, no burst, no spectacle. Just a quiet stabilization of every signal we had been tracking. The seed's rotation settled into a perfect harmonic. The magnetic pulses smoothed into a steady cadence, and the dark facet aligned directly toward Earth. Not toward our instruments, not toward the sun, toward us, as though the object had finally chosen its observer. The moment the alignment peaked, the distortion around the dark facet sharpened into a crystalline gradient, a clean geometric fold in space. No energy spike, no radiation. Instead, the vacuum behaved like a membrane pulled taut. My instruments couldn't categorize it. Space wasn't bending or warping. It was rearranging, adopting the symmetry of the gap. The void inside the lattice was projecting outward, framing a doorway made not of matter, but of information. A doorway that expected an answer. The seed had spent weeks listening to our attempts at interpretation, mapping our analytic patterns, learning the structure of our curiosity, and now By stabilizing the distortion into a deliberate geometry, it presented a final question, not spoken, not coded, but implied. What will you contribute? I ran the symmetry models again, now synchronized with the seed's stabilized rhythm. The gap responded instantly. The elongated interval pulsed with faint resonance, its frequency rising fractionally whenever my prediction aligned with its internal lattice. It wasn't waiting for a signal from us. It was waiting for a concept, an idea, a structural addition that would slot into the void without fracturing the design. The realization was both humbling and terrifying. The seed wasn't judging our technology. It wasn't judging our intelligence. It was judging our ability to think in harmony with something older, wider, shaped by minds that solved problems differently than we do. It was asking whether we could participate in the continuation of a story that began long before our species existed. I submitted the simplest answer I could, a symmetry transformation based not on dominance or preservation, but on extension, a mathematical gesture of continuity rather than disruption, a structure that acknowledged the gap without trying to control it, a recognition of mystery as part of the architecture. For a long moment, nothing changed. Then the dark facet brightened, not with light, but with structure. Fractals spiraled across its surface, each one mapping to the new transformation I had introduced. The seed had accepted the answer, or at least it had not rejected it. The internal lattice reconfigured, the elongated interval contracted slightly, and the resonance hierarchy shifted just enough to suggest that the archive inside had moved into a new state, not fully open, not fully closed, somewhere between. A hinge turned, not yet swung, and then just as silently as it had awakened, 3I Atlas began accelerating away from the sun. No flare of propulsion, no outgassing, just a clean, graceful departure along a trajectory that defied gravitational prediction. The resonance faded. The magnetic pulses quieted. The dark facet dimmed until the object became nothing more than a distant, tumbling point of reflected starlight. It wasn't leaving because its task was complete. It was leaving because ours had just begun. Somewhere inside the lattice now sat a new interval, our interval, woven into the architecture of a civilization we will never meet. A contribution small enough to be forgotten, yet permanent enough to survive stars. A seed within a seed, drifting into the dark. As the object vanished beyond our reach, one final thought settled over me with unshakable clarity. 3I Atlas was never meant to give us answers. It was meant to see whether we could become part of one.